When you look at avoidant dynamics through a psychological lens, one thing becomes very clear. There is often an unconscious chase control loop operating beneath the surface. It is not always intentional, and that is what makes it powerful. The avoidance system is built around emotional self-protection. When closeness feels overwhelming, they create distance. And when distance is met with pursuit, explanations, or emotional pressure, they regain a sense of control. Not because they are trying to harm anyone, but because control equals safety in their internal wiring. Now here is where most people unknowingly reinforce the very pattern they are trying to escape. The moment rejection appears, the instinct is to resist it, to clarify, to prove, to re-engage, to ask for closure, to chase understanding that the other person is not fully willing to give. And every one of those responses, while deeply human, feeds the exact mechanism that keeps the avoidant emotionally disengaged. It confirms their belief that closeness equals pressure, and pressure equals exit. But something fundamentally shifts when you stop participating in that loop. When you accept rejection, not in defeat but in grounded awareness, you interrupt the entire emotional economy of the dynamic. There is no chase, there is no protest, there is no emotional escalation. Instead, there is something the avoidance system is not accustomed to receiving in that moment. Emotional non-reactivity, calm closure, internal stability without external demand. And this is where psychology becomes fascinating, because the avoidant mind is not only scanning for threat, it is also constantly scanning for control points. If they can predict your reaction, they feel positioned. If they can anticipate your pursuit, they feel safe in their distance. But when you accept rejection cleanly, without emotional collapse and without resistance, you remove yourself from the predictable script. There is no leverage left to engage with. And what often gets misunderstood here is that this is not about playing games or creating distance to trigger a reaction. It is far more subtle and far more powerful than that. It is about no longer outsourcing your emotional equilibrium to someone who has already stepped out of relational alignment. That shift alone changes the entire energetic structure of the interaction. From a cognitive standpoint, unpredictability creates attention, not chaos, but stable unpredictability, meaning you do not behave in the expected protest pattern. You do not escalate. You do not plead. You do not chase. You simply acknowledge reality and withdraw your emotional investment. And in that absence of reaction, the avoidant nervous system experiences something unfamiliar, the loss of control over your emotional state. That is the moment recalibration begins. Because now, instead of managing your pursuit, they are faced with the absence of it. Instead of responding to your emotional intensity, they are confronted with your emotional neutrality. And neutrality is far more psychologically disruptive than pursuit because it cannot be easily categorized. It does not fit into their defensive framework. What this ultimately reveals is a deeper truth about human attachment systems. People do not only respond to presence, they respond to how that presence behaves under pressure. And when you demonstrate that rejection does not destabilize you, you are no longer seen through the lens of dependency, you are seen through the lens of autonomy. That is the paradox. The very act of accepting rejection dissolves the psychological grip of the dynamic. And in that dissolution, something unexpected often emerges on the other side. Curiosity, reflection, and in some cases, renewed interest. Not because you chased, but because you stopped. And here is the final insight most people miss entirely. You are not teaching the avoidant to value you more. You are revealing whether they were ever emotionally equipped to value stability in the first place. Because once you accept rejection with clarity and self-possession, you are no longer inside their emotional system. You are observing it from the outside. And from that distance, everything becomes visible. The chase ends. The control dissolves. And what remains is truth. And in that truth, you either lose someone who could not meet you, or you finally become someone who cannot be pulled into losing themselves again. Most people misunderstand what actually changes the emotional temperature of a relationship after rejection. They assume it's words, explanations, or intensity that create impact. But psychologically, it is contrast, not communication, that shifts perception. When someone with avoidant tendencies distances themselves or rejects intimacy, the typical response from the other side is emotional protest. That can look like over-explaining, trying to reestablish connection, seeking reassurance, or attempting to resolve uncertainty immediately. And from the outside, that behavior feels logical. It feels like love trying to repair itself. But internally, it reinforces a very specific pattern. Emotional pursuit meets emotional withdrawal. Pressure meets distance. And the nervous system of the avoidant partner learns once again that closeness equals demand. Now imagine something different happens. Instead of protest, there is stillness. Instead of emotional escalation, there is acceptance. Instead of chasing clarity, there is a quiet recognition of reality without resistance. You do not argue with the rejection. You do not inflate its meaning. You simply acknowledge it and return to yourself. That is where contrast begins. Because now, the avoidant is no longer encountering what they predicted. They expected emotional pursuit. They expected discomfort, questions, maybe even resistance. But what they receive instead is emotional neutrality. And neutrality is powerful precisely because it is unfamiliar in that context. From a psychological standpoint, the human brain is wired to detect deviations from expectation. When behavior matches prediction, the mind relaxes. When behavior contradicts prediction, attention increases. Not emotional chaos, but cognitive recalibration. The system starts asking questions it was not prepared to ask. Why wasn't there a reaction? Why wasn't there pursuit? Why wasn't there pressure? And more importantly, what does that say about the emotional availability they assumed they were dealing with? This is where emotional contrast becomes transformative, because in their mind, rejection was supposed to conclude the dynamic. It was supposed to create distance and finality. But when rejection is met with calm acceptance instead of emotional collapse, the meaning of the rejection itself begins to shift. It is no longer reinforced as a moment of power over you. It becomes a moment of uncertainty about you. And uncertainty is psychologically active. It lingers. It circulates. It reprocesses the emotional data of the interaction in a way certainty never does. Certainty closes loops. Uncertainty keeps them open. At the same time, your emotional posture communicates something far more significant than words ever could: stability. And stability is not the absence of feeling. It is the presence of control over feeling. It signals that your emotional world is not dependent on immediate validation or response. For someone with avoidant tendencies, this creates a subtle disruption in their internal model of the relationship, because they are no longer interacting with someone who escalates under emotional pressure. They are interacting with someone who absorbs it and remains centered. And that difference is not small. It is structurally significant. It forces a reevaluation of assumptions. And here is the deeper layer. Emotional contrast does not manipulate perception. It reveals it. It exposes whether the connection was built on genuine resonance or on a dynamic of pursuit and withdrawal. Because when pursuit disappears, only truth remains visible. In many cases, this is the moment where internal conflict begins on their side. Not because they suddenly realize what they lost, but because the expected emotional script has been broken. And when scripts break, the mind searches for explanation. What just happened? Why did it feel different this time? Why did I not get the reaction I usually get? That search is where emotional re-engagement often begins. Not from pressure, but from reflection. And this is the paradox that most people miss entirely. You do not increase your value by trying to be chosen. You increase your psychological impact by no longer reacting in the ways that make you predictable. Because predictability makes you manageable. And manageability in emotionally avoidant dynamics often reduces perceived value. But when you introduce contrast, calm where chaos was expected, distance where pursuit was assumed, you shift the entire frame of reference. You are no longer part of their emotional reaction cycle. You become the variable they cannot easily compute. And that is where perception changes, not through force, but through interruption. Because sometimes the most powerful emotional statement you can make is not, "I want you," but "I am still whole without you." And in that silence, something begins to echo far louder than words ever could. What most people don't realize about avoidant attachment is that emotional suppression is not the same as emotional absence. It is stored, not deleted. It is delayed, not destroyed. And when distance enters the system, real uncontested distance, the mind begins a very specific process that psychology understands well: emotional retrieval through memory reconstruction. When you are actively pursuing someone who is avoidant, the system stays occupied. There is noise, there is interaction, there is push and pull, and the emotional brain stays in a reactive state. But when you accept rejection and remove yourself from that cycle, something subtle happens in their internal landscape. The external stimulation decreases, and the mind begins to fill the gap with internal processing. And what gets processed first is not logic, it is memory. But not memory in its raw form, memory in its reconstructed form. Human beings do not remember relationships like recordings. We remember them through emotional snapshots, moments of comfort, moments of tension, moments where we felt seen, moments where we felt overwhelmed. And the brain has a bias. It tends to retrieve emotionally charged memories when the present environment is quieter than the past dynamic. So when you stop chasing, when you stop explaining, when you stop participating in the emotional back and forth, you create something very important: silence in the system. And silence is not empty. It is active space for reflection. Now here's where the avoidance structure becomes particularly interesting. Avoidant individuals often use emotional distancing as a regulation strategy. When intensity rises, they disconnect internally. They minimize, they compartmentalize, they move away from emotional processing in real time. But that does not mean the emotional data disappears. It simply gets stored without full integration. So when you are present and pursuing, they can continue avoiding integration. But when you are absent, not emotionally pulling, not seeking closure, not filling the space with urgency, the stored emotional material begins to surface. And it rarely surfaces in a linear way. It comes in fragments: a conversation that felt safe, a moment where they felt understood, a time when connection felt effortless. And because there is no longer active emotional pressure from you, the mind is free to reevaluate those fragments without defensive interruption. This is where absence becomes psychologically active. Absence does not mean nothing is happening. It means everything is happening internally without external influence. And what often emerges in this stage is not immediate regret, but emotional contrast within memory itself. The mind begins to compare the current emotional emptiness with the remembered emotional presence. And this comparison is not always conscious. It operates beneath awareness. They may not think, "I miss this person." Instead, they feel a subtle emotional discrepancy, a sense that something meaningful is no longer accessible. And because avoidant individuals are often more comfortable with distance than emotional engagement, they do not immediately interpret this as longing. They interpret it as curiosity, reflection, or sometimes even confusion. But underneath all of that, the emotional system is doing something very simple. It is reweighting significance. What felt easy to dismiss in proximity begins to feel more substantial in absence, not because you have changed, but because their access to you has changed. And access is one of the most underestimated forces in human psychology. We assign value not only based on what something is, but also on how available it is to us. When something is always within reach, the emotional brain treats it as stable background. When something becomes unavailable, it becomes foreground. That shift alone is enough to trigger reevaluation. But there is another layer here that is even more important. When you are no longer present to regulate their discomfort, they are left alone with the emotional residue of the connection. And in that space, the mind does something it always does when unresolved emotion remains. It seeks completion. Not necessarily reconnection, but completion, closure, understanding, meaning. And meaning is where emotional memory deepens. Because now they are not just remembering you, they are interpreting what you represented emotionally. Safety, pressure, freedom, connection, overwhelm. Whatever the dominant emotional imprint was, it becomes clearer in your absence because there is no longer a competing input. And clarity in absence is often more powerful than intensity in presence. This is why stepping back changes perception over time. Not because you are actively influencing them, but because you are no longer interrupting the internal processing that naturally occurs when emotional distance is created. And here is the deeper truth most people miss. You are not inside their memory fighting for space. You are inside their memory being reassembled without interference. And how you are reassembled depends not on what you say, but on what remains when you stop saying anything at all. Because silence, when handled with emotional maturity, does not erase you. It reveals you. And in that revelation, absence becomes the loudest form of presence they will ever experience again. What shifts the entire emotional architecture of a relationship after rejection is not pursuit, it's positioning. And positioning begins the moment you stop negotiating for someone else's presence and start standing in your own. Most people don't realize that when rejection happens, there are two possible responses happening simultaneously. One is external, what you do with the other person, and the other is internal, what you do with your sense of self. And in avoidant dynamics, the internal response is the one that determines everything. When someone rejects you and you respond with pursuit, explanation, or emotional urgency, the underlying message, whether intended or not, is, "I need this connection to feel complete." And that creates an energetic imbalance. Not mystical energy, but psychological perception. You are now positioned as someone who is seeking validation from the very source that just withdrew it. But when you accept rejection and stop trying to restore proximity, something fundamental changes in how you are perceived. Not because you are performing detachment, but because you are demonstrating it. You are no longer operating from the position of need. You are operating from the position of self-containment, and that is where respect begins to form. Not performative respect, but psychological recalibration. Because humans, especially in relational uncertainty, constantly assess two things: how much access they have to you and how much control they have over your emotional state. When you are pursuing, both are high. They have access to your attention and they have indirect influence over your emotional stability. But when you accept rejection and withdraw from that pursuit, both of those variables change at once. Access decreases. Emotional influence disappears. And what replaces it is something far more compelling: self-directed stability. This is where respect and attraction begin to overlap, but not in a simplistic way. It is not that rejection suddenly creates desire. It is that emotional independence repositions you outside of the old dynamic entirely. You are no longer responding within the framework of "do they want me or not?" You are now operating from a framework of "this is what I allow in my life." And that shift is felt, even if it is not consciously analyzed. Because the avoidant nervous system, which is highly sensitive to emotional pressure and relational expectation, registers the absence of demand as safety. But more importantly, it registers the presence of self-definition as strength. And strength changes perception. There is a subtle but important psychological distinction here. You are not proving your worth by leaving. You are revealing that your worth was never dependent on staying in an unstable exchange. That distinction is what separates emotional dependence from emotional sovereignty. And sovereignty has a very specific effect on human perception. It reduces the illusion of control. When someone believes they can easily influence your emotional state, they unconsciously assign you to a category of emotional availability that is predictable. But when that influence disappears, when your emotional state is no longer externally adjustable, you become less predictable and therefore more cognitively significant. The mind pays attention to what it cannot easily regulate, and this is where the dynamic quietly transforms. Not because you are trying to be distant, but because you are no longer available for emotional negotiation that undermines your stability. You are not punishing. You are not withdrawing to provoke. You are simply no longer participating in a system that requires you to abandon yourself in order to stay connected. That is the real shift, because what begins to register on the other side is not loss in the dramatic sense, but absence of influence. And the absence of influence creates a very specific psychological discomfort, recalibration of assumed power dynamics. They are no longer interacting with someone who bends under relational pressure. They are interacting with someone who remains intact under it. And that changes the internal reference point of the relationship entirely. What once felt like a dynamic of pursuit and retreat becomes something else: observation. And when someone shifts from participant to observer in your emotional life, it is often because you have stopped participating in theirs. That is the paradox most people miss. You do not increase your value by trying to be chosen. You increase the clarity of your value by refusing to abandon yourself in the process of being evaluated. Because at the deepest level, people do not chase what they can control. They are drawn to what remains centered when control is no longer possible. And once you reach that state, you are no longer reacting to rejection. You are redefining what rejection even means in the first place. And in that redefinition, the entire power structure quietly dissolves, and something far more grounded takes its place: self-respect that no longer negotiates for permission. What most people misunderstand about emotional unavailability is that it is not simply about distance. It is about regulation. Avoidant individuals are not disconnected from emotion. They are selectively connected to it depending on whether the emotional environment feels controllable. And that is why availability plays such a critical role in how attraction and perception evolve over time. When you are emotionally available in a reactive way, meaning your attention, validation, and energy are easily accessible, the nervous system of the other person adapts quickly, not necessarily in a conscious or intentional sense, but in a conditioning sense. They learn that access to you is consistent, predictable, and low resistance. And when something becomes that accessible, the brain begins to categorize it as stable background rather than emotionally significant foreground. But when you accept rejection and shift into grounded unavailability, something subtle but profound happens. You are no longer withdrawing to create tension. You are simply no longer emotionally reachable in the same way. You are not chasing. You are not negotiating. You are not waiting to be reinvited into closeness. You are continuing your life without attempting to reverse a decision that has already been made. And this is where the psychological reevaluation begins, because now the emotional system on the other side is no longer interacting with availability. It is interacting with absence that has structure. And structured absence is very different from emotional chaos or emotional protest. It is calm. It is consistent. It is self-contained. And that combination creates cognitive dissonance in someone who expected continued emotional access. They are no longer able to predict your responsiveness. And unpredictability in relational psychology is one of the primary triggers for attention reorientation. But this is not about manipulation. It is about what happens when a person who was previously emotionally accessible becomes internally anchored elsewhere. Your attention is no longer orbiting the relationship. It is orbiting your own life, your own direction, your own internal priorities, and that recentering changes everything. Because emotional availability is not just about presence, it is about direction. When your emotional energy is directed outward towards someone who has withdrawn, it creates a loop. But when that same energy is redirected inward toward your own stability, growth, and clarity, the loop breaks. And when loops break, the system is forced to reassess its assumptions. On the avoidant side, this often creates an unexpected experience. Absence without pursuit, distance without pursuit, silence without emotional demand. And that combination does something very specific in human cognition. It removes the pressure of reaction and replaces it with reflection. Now, reflection is where reevaluation begins, because in your absence, they are no longer managing your emotional responses. They are now left with their own internal responses to your absence. And those internal responses are rarely immediate or linear. They unfold gradually through moments of comparison, memory activation, and situational contrast. They may notice the lack of your presence in moments they did not anticipate. They may recall interactions that felt easier than expected. They may begin to contrast current emotional neutrality with past emotional engagement. And none of this requires conscious effort. It happens automatically when emotional stimuli are removed. But here is the key distinction. This is not about making someone miss you. It is about removing yourself from a position where your presence was taken for granted as emotionally available at all times. Because when availability is constant, it becomes invisible. But when availability is withdrawn through grounded self-direction, not punishment, not silence as a tactic, but genuine redirection of life, then presence itself gains weight in memory. And this is where perception begins to shift. Not because you are doing more, but because you are no longer doing the same things that kept you emotionally predictable. And predictability is what lowers perceived value in unstable attachment dynamics. So when you become less available in a calm, non-reactive way, you are not creating distance to trigger a reaction. You are simply no longer living inside the relational expectation that requires you to stay emotionally open to someone who has stepped back. And that changes how you are remembered, not just how you are perceived in the present moment. Because people do not only respond to who is present, they respond to who is no longer participating in the emotional exchange. And when you stop participating, you stop being experienced as a reaction and start being experienced as a presence that requires intention to access again. And that is where the dynamic quietly flips. Because what was once assumed becomes uncertain. And what becomes uncertain begins to regain psychological weight. And in that space, the most powerful realization emerges. Not that you are trying to be missed, but that your absence requires more emotional effort to ignore than your presence ever required to maintain. And that is the moment everything changes, when your unavailability becomes more noticeable than your availability ever was. What ultimately determines whether someone gets pulled back into an avoidant dynamic or completely exits it is not what the other person does. It is what they become when the emotional structure collapses. And rejection, when truly accepted, does something far more important than ending a connection. It forces identity to reorganize itself outside of the relationship entirely. Most people think growth happens after someone comes back or after clarity is given. But psychologically, real transformation begins the moment you stop organizing your identity around being chosen. Because as long as your sense of self is still orbiting someone else's decision, you are still inside the same emotional system, just in a different position. position. When you accept rejection with clarity, something subtle but profound happens. You stop performing emotional survival and start building emotional identity. That is the shift most people miss. It is not about pretending to be okay. It is about no longer structuring your internal world around whether someone returns or not. And that shift is where separation begins. Not from the person, but from the pattern. Because avoidant dynamics are not just about two individuals. They are about a repeating psychological loop. Pursuit, withdrawal, uncertainty, re-engagement. And as long as you are emotionally entangled in that loop, even in absence, you are still part of it. But when you accept rejection fully, something breaks. Not externally, but internally. You stop reacting to the cycle and start observing it from outside. And observation changes everything. Because now your decisions are no longer driven by emotional urgency. They are driven by clarity. You are no longer asking, what do I need to do to be seen again? You are asking, who do I become when I'm no longer trying to be seen by someone who stepped away? That question alone changes the trajectory of your emotional development. And this is where most people underestimate the power of self-reconstruction. Because when the emotional bond loses its active grip, there is a void that opens, not just relationally, but psychologically. And that void is either filled with regression or growth. Regression means returning to old patterns of chasing, waiting, or hoping for re-entry into the same dynamic. Growth means using that space to rebuild identity outside of attachment validation. And that rebuilding is where emotional independence is actually forged. You begin to reconnect with parts of yourself that were previously organized around relational response. Your focus, your discipline, your emotional regulation, your direction. You start making decisions that are no longer influenced by whether someone might notice or return. And that independence is not loud. It is quiet, internal, and structural. And here is the paradox. This internal restructuring is often what creates the strongest external shift in perception. Because when you are no longer emotionally available in a fragmented or reactive way, people who were previously used to accessing that emotional responsiveness begin to notice a difference. Not because you are trying to be different, but because you are no longer organized around them. And that absence of emotional centrality is powerful. It signals that the emotional economy has changed, that access is no longer assumed, that your attention is no longer a default setting. It is now something intentional, something earned by alignment rather than history. But perhaps the most important part of this transformation is not what it does to the other person. It is what it does to you. Because once you stop orbiting the question of whether someone comes back, you begin to inhabit a different psychological space entirely. You stop living in anticipation and start living in presence. You stop interpreting your worth through relational outcomes and start grounding it in internal stability. And from that place, even the idea of rejection loses its emotional authority over you. It no longer defines direction. It no longer dictates value. It becomes an event, not an identity. And that is the deepest form of separation, not from a person, but from the emotional dependency that made their presence feel necessary for your stability. And ironically, that is often the exact moment when the dynamic itself loses